What if the God you've been praying to your entire life isn't real, not in the way the atheists mean it? I'm not talking about the existence of God. I'm talking about something far more disturbing, far closer to home, and far harder to admit. What if the version of God living in your head right now, the one you pray to, the one you thank when things go well and bargain with when things fall apart, is not God at all? What if it's a construction, a projection, a version of God you invented, unconsciously, gradually, conveniently, to fit the life you were already living? A.W. Tozer asked this question in the 1950s, and the answer he arrived at was so uncomfortable that most of the religious world quietly ignored it, filed it under too intense, and went back to the comfortable version of faith they preferred. But the question didn't go away. It never does. Tozer wrote, "What comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. Not what church you attend, not how often you read your Bible, not how many Christian conferences you've been to or how many worship albums are on your playlist. The most important thing about you, the thing that determines the entire shape of your inner life, is the image of God that lives in your mind when nobody is watching. And most people have never seriously examined that image. That is what we are going to do today, and I want to warn you, this is not going to be comfortable." Tozer was not a comfortable writer. He was not a comfortable preacher. People who sat under his teaching described it as being simultaneously illuminated and convicted, like standing in a light so bright it showed everything you had been hiding, including things you didn't know you were hiding from yourself. So if you're looking for encouragement, for a feel-good message that sends you away feeling validated and unchanged, this is not that video. But if you are willing to sit with the discomfort of a real question, asked with real seriousness, stay. Because what is on the other side of this discomfort is the most important thing you will ever find. Let's start with a fact that most people in religious spaces find deeply unsettling. Human beings are not naturally inclined toward accurate theology. We are naturally inclined toward comfortable theology. And there is a profound difference between the two. Comfortable theology gives you a God who mostly agrees with you, a God whose priorities align with yours, a God who is primarily concerned with your happiness, your success, your sense of security, a God who is, in the most honest possible description, a slightly more powerful version of your best friend, one who wants the best for you as you define the best, who is grieved by your pain and delighted by your victories, and who fundamentally sees the world more or less the way you do. This God is enormously popular. He is preached in thousands of churches every Sunday. He fills stadiums. He has a massive social media following. He is cited in acceptance speeches and career announcements and posts about new houses and new cars and new opportunities. He is warm. He is affirming. He is manageable. And according to Tozer, he does not exist. The God of Tozer's theology is something else entirely. Listen to how he opens his book, The Knowledge of the Holy, a book that many theologians consider one of the most important works of Christian thought written in the 20th century. What we think about when we think about God is the most important thing about us. Perverted notions about God soon rot the religion in which they appear. Perverted notions. Not mistaken notions, not underdeveloped notions, perverted. That is a strong word, and Tozer chose it deliberately because he was not describing minor theological inaccuracies. He was describing something systemic, a deep structural distortion in the way modern people conceive of the divine. A distortion so pervasive that it had, in his view, fundamentally hollowed out the spiritual life of the majority of people who considered themselves faithful. To understand what Tozer meant, we need to understand something about the psychology of belief, something that cognitive science has spent the last 50 years mapping with increasing precision, and that confirms what Tozer saw with startling accuracy. In 2009, psychologists from the University of Chicago published a study that sent quiet shockwaves through the academic community. The researchers asked participants a series of questions about their own moral and political views, and then asked them to predict what God's views on those same issues would be. The results were striking. Participants consistently attributed to God positions that closely mirrored their own. And when the researchers artificially manipulated participants' opinions on certain issues, their perception of God's opinion on those same issues shifted accordingly. In other words, people don't form their view of God and then align their opinions with it. They form their opinions first, and then unconsciously shape their view of God to match. The researchers called this process religious projection. And it is not a fringe phenomenon. It is not something that only happens to unsophisticated believers or to people who haven't thought carefully about their faith. It happens to everyone. It is a default feature of human cognition, a bias so deeply embedded in the way we process information that it operates almost entirely below the level of conscious awareness. Tozer had no access to this research. He was writing 40 years before it was published. But he described the same phenomenon with devastating clarity. The idolater simply imagines things about God and acts as if they were true. And then he added something that should stop every person who considers themselves a serious believer cold. Millions of Christians worship a God who is morally identical to themselves. Morally identical to themselves. Sit with that for a moment, because if it is true, and the psychological research suggests it is happening on a massive, unconscious scale, then the implications are staggering. It means that for many people, prayer is not a conversation with a being whose nature transcends their own. It is an internal monologue dressed in religious language. It means that worship is not an encounter with something genuinely other, something that disrupts, challenges, and reorders your inner world. It is a sophisticated form of self-affirmation. It means that the spiritual life, as most people practice it, is not a journey towards something real and external and demanding. It is a journey deeper into themselves, decorated with sacred language and experienced as transcendence. This is what Tozer called the low view of God, and he argued passionately, relentlessly, across decades of preaching and writing, that it was the single most dangerous spiritual condition a person could be in, not because it produces overtly wicked behavior, but because it produces the appearance of faith with none of its transformative power. It creates people who are religious without being changed, devoted without being different, active in their faith without being genuinely encountered by the thing their faith points toward. He wrote, "We have lost our spirit of worship and our ability to withdraw inwardly to meet God in adoring silence." And he connected this loss directly to the low view of God, because you cannot genuinely worship something you have domesticated. You cannot be in awe of something you have made in your own image. You cannot be transformed by an encounter with a God who fundamentally confirms everything you already are. Transformation requires encounter with genuine otherness. And genuine otherness is exactly what the constructed God cannot provide. But here is where the story takes a turn that most people don't see coming. Because if the constructed God is a psychological default, if projection is built into the architecture of human cognition, then the question is not whether you are doing this. The question is whether you know you are doing it, and whether you are willing to do the terrifying thing Tozer spent his life calling people to do. Look directly at the image in your mind. Compare it to what the historical, theological, and spiritual tradition actually says about God, and be willing to let the gap between those two things break something in you. Because Tozer was absolutely clear about what happens when a person genuinely encounters the God who is actually there. not the constructed version, not the comfortable version, not the version that fits their existing life and validates their existing choices. What happens is not peace, not immediately, not. What happens first is what the great mystics called the dark night of the soul, a season of profound disorientation in which everything you thought you knew about God, about yourself, and about the relationship between the two is exposed as partial, as distorted, as insufficient. Isaiah saw God in the temple and immediately said, "Woe is me, for I am undone." Not "thank you for this wonderful experience," not "I feel so affirmed and seen right now." Undone, dismantled, reduced to his actual size in the presence of something so vastly beyond him that the encounter was, in the most literal sense, shattering. Job argued with God across 37 chapters, and when God finally answered, Job had nothing left to say. Not because God gave him explanations, but because the encounter itself revealed that the framework within which Job had been asking his questions was not large enough to contain the answer. Moses asked to see God's glory and was told, "You cannot see my face and live," not a metaphor, a description of what happens when a finite human consciousness comes into actual contact with the infinite. The cognitive and spiritual architecture simply cannot hold it without being fundamentally altered. Tozer read these accounts and concluded something that most modern religious culture refuses to accept. The absence of disruption in your spiritual life is not evidence of spiritual health. It may be evidence of the opposite. It may be evidence that you have never truly encountered the God who is actually there. Only the comfortable echo of yourself that you have been calling God. He wrote, "The man who has God for his treasure has all things in one." But the key word in that sentence is genuinely has, not merely claims, not merely believes in the abstract, not merely performs devotion toward. And genuine having in Tozer's framework always comes at the cost of something. Always requires the destruction of something smaller to make room for something larger. This is where Tozer connects to something that the psychological research on post-traumatic growth has been quietly confirming for decades. In studies on what researchers call meaning-making after crisis, the process by which people reconstruct their understanding of the world and themselves after shattering experiences, one consistent finding stands out above the others. People who emerge from crisis with deeper, more resilient and more genuinely meaningful inner lives are almost always people whose prior frameworks were not just challenged, but broken. Not bent, not stretched, broken. People whose pre-crisis belief systems, including their religious beliefs, proved insufficient to contain what they experienced, and who were therefore forced to build something new on deeper foundations. In other words, the shattering was not incidental to the growth. It was the mechanism of the growth. Tozer understood this not as a psychological phenomenon, but as a spiritual one. He called it the crucifixion of the self, the painful, necessary, non-optional process by which the constructed self, with its constructed God and its constructed theology and its constructed spiritual comfort, is dismantled so that something real can emerge. And here is the part that most people miss, the part that changes everything when you finally see it. Tozer was not pessimistic about this process. He was not describing it as a tragedy. He was describing it as the only pathway to what he called true knowledge of God, a knowledge so different in quality from the constructed version that it barely shares the same name. He wrote, "To have found God and still to pursue him is the soul's paradox of love. The person who has genuinely encountered the real God, not the comfortable echo, does not become less hungry. They become more hungry. Not because they received less than they expected, but because what they received was so real, so genuinely other, so far beyond anything they could have constructed or projected or imagined, that the encounter opened a capacity for more that they did not know existed before. This is the difference between religion as performance and faith as encounter. Performance is always moving toward completion, toward a state where you have done enough, believed enough, appeared faithful enough. Encounter is always moving toward more depth, not because the destination recedes, but because the encounter itself expands your capacity to receive. Tozer practiced this expansion deliberately, daily, across 50 years of ministry. He read widely, not just theology, but philosophy, literature, science. He prayed for hours, not as a discipline he imposed on himself, but as a practice he was genuinely drawn to. He wrote with a ferocity of attention that people who knew him described as almost frightening, as if every sentence was being pulled out of him by something he was trying desperately to accurately describe before it slipped away. And what he was trying to describe, across every book, every sermon, every essay, was this: there is a God who is actually there, not the one you invented, not the one who is morally identical to you, not the one who fits inside the framework of your existing life and asks nothing that disrupts it. The one who is actually there, who is holy in a way that language barely touches, who is sovereign in a way that removes all of your bargaining positions, who is loving in a way that is nothing like the sentimental warmth the word usually implies. And encountering that God, the real one, will cost you the comfortable one. It will cost you the version of yourself that was sustained by the comfortable one. It will cost you the theological constructions that kept the real God at a safe distance while giving you the feeling of devotion. And what you get in exchange is not comfort. Not initially. What you get is reality. And Tozer spent his entire life arguing with the intensity of a man who had paid the price himself and found it worth every cent, that reality, however disorienting, however demanding, however shattering to what came before, is always better than the most comfortable illusion. God is not what you think he is, Tozer said from 100 different angles across a lifetime of ministry. And the sooner that thought breaks you, the sooner you become capable of knowing who he actually is. That sentence is either the most important thing you will hear today, or it will wash over you like every other religious sentence you have heard 1,000 times and never quite allowed to land. I want to ask you to let it land, not to agree with it immediately, not to perform agreement with it because it sounds spiritually sophisticated, but to actually sit with the question it opens. What is the God in my head actually like? What does he want? What does he require? What does he say about the parts of me that I prefer not to examine? Does he ever surprise me? Does he ever ask for something I wasn't already planning to give? Does he ever respond in ways I didn't expect, didn't want, didn't find immediately comforting? Because if the answer to all of those questions is no, if the God in your head is perfectly predictable, perfectly aligned with your preferences, perfectly manageable within the structure of the life you've already chosen, then Tozer would say, you have not yet met God. You have met yourself, dressed in the language of the divine, and the invitation, the terrifying, costly, life-altering invitation, is to be willing to let that constructed version be dismantled. To approach the question of who God actually is with the same intellectual honesty and the same willingness to be wrong that you would bring to any other serious investigation. To sit with the discomfort of not knowing, rather than filling the discomfort with a construction that soothes but does not save. This is not an easy invitation. Tozer never pretended it was. He wrote about his own journey toward it with a candor that is almost disarming, describing the resistance, the false starts, the moments of genuine terror when the constructed version began to crack and he was not yet sure what was on the other side. But he also wrote about what he found on the other side, and the words he used were not the words of a man who found disappointment or emptiness, or the cold silence of an absent God. They were the words of a man who found something so real, so vast, so genuinely other, and so genuinely good, that every price he had paid to get there felt, in retrospect, like almost nothing. To know God is at once the easiest and the most difficult thing in the world, he wrote. Easy because God is not hiding, difficult because finding the real God requires first losing the fake one. And losing the fake one feels from the inside exactly like losing God. That is the place most people stop. That is the threshold most people refuse to cross. The moment when the comfortable construction begins to feel insufficient and the real thing has not yet come clearly into view, and the temptation to rebuild the comfortable construction quickly is almost overwhelming. Tozer's entire life was an argument against stopping at that threshold. An argument made not in abstract theological propositions, but in the lived reality of a man who crossed it, who kept crossing it year after year, deeper and deeper, and who came back each time with words that have outlasted him by 60 years and show no sign of losing their power. So I want to close with a question, not an easy one, not one you can answer in the comments with a Bible verse and a heart emoji. A real question that I want you to sit with for the rest of today and however many days it takes to answer honestly. When is the last time your understanding of God genuinely surprised you? When is the last time something you encountered in prayer, in scripture, in the experience of living, genuinely disrupted your existing image of who God is? When is the last time your theology had to expand to contain something that didn't fit inside it? If you can't remember, if the God in your mind has been largely consistent, largely predictable, largely confirming of what you already believed for as long as you can, remember, then Tozer would say, the work has not yet begun, the real journey hasn't started. What you have is religion. What you are looking for is God. And those two things, as Tozer spent his entire life showing us, are not always the same thing. Tell me in the comments, has there ever been a moment when your image of God was shattered? When what you thought you knew turned out to be too small? What happened? What did you find on the other side of that shattering? Because someone watching this right now is standing at exactly that threshold. The comfortable construction is cracking and they are terrified of what comes next. And your story might be the thing that tells them, keep going, it is worth it. What is on the other side is more real than anything you are leaving behind.